World leaders declare war, their people do the fighting. However, it's the children who suffer the most. Whether in their backyard or far, far away, war is traumatic. So how do you then talk to children about war, and as well as allay any fears and anxiety brought on by images on the news? Let's discuss this with Dr. Shaheda Omar from the Teddy Bear Foundation. Thank you so much for your time, Doc, and good morning to you. That's the big question this morning. How do we simplify, clarify and explain what's happening around the world, particularly in the Ukraine and Russia, war there, to young children who are either seeing these visuals on TV or experiencing them in the country as we speak?
So it is a very hard and difficult conversation, especially when the adults themselves are so distressed and faced with insecurities, anxieties and stress levels being extremely high. However, the starting point is that one needs to have developmentally age-appropriate conversations. Firstly, to check out what is it, whether it's a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old and even older, to check out what is it that they've heard, what do they understand, and then respond, firstly, to take a few deep breaths themselves, find a moment during playtime or bedtime routine and speak to the child and explain to the child without all the gory details, to say there's a disagreement, it's about protecting people, but also instilling a sense of hope, to say we are in this together, we are going to see this through together. So those are kind of conversations, but at the same time minimize the exposure to news, minimize having conversations that children may overhear, because that in itself will instill a lot of fears and anxieties. And also something that parents need to do is to ensure that children, are given facts, but not too much detail.
Would that
allow them to ask
If I may just jump in there, Doc, due to time, how traumatic can a time like this be for young children? How traumatic is it for them? Because I think we take it for granted that they're just watching it on television. Perhaps they're not processing what's happening quite as clearly as the adults do. But how traumatic can it be for children?
Thank you, Tumelo. It's very traumatic, because if we mustn't even discount and dismiss the fact that we've just dealt with a global pandemic and are still dealing with that, and the multiple losses, the insecurities, anxieties. So for this, many children are extremely fearful of losing their loved ones and fearful of what's going to happen next, because the uncertainty, the unpredictability. So it is compounded with a lot of fear. But I think people are still struggling from the aftermath of the pandemic. So the post-traumatic stress disorder is something that we need to factor in and, of course, address this with children, and where possible, speak to them about people that are helping out there, distract the child of what can we do as a family, how can we reach out and assist. So reframing, positive reframing is critical.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because my next question was about, do they feel helpless at this time as children? Do they want to help? Do they feel like they want to do more than just sit back and watch, perhaps, either via donation or, for those who are, of course, religious, through prayer and just giving a thought to what's happening on the ground in, parts of the world that are going through war?
And indeed, that's the way to go, to actually say, okay, let's gather a few toys, let's get a few little foods, let's get bread together, let's go out or send to the neighbors. Those are the kind of things. But also to engage children in the playtime routine, where you actually just tell stories to each other, short stories, and the other person continues, and you end with a positive note. Get the child to draw. I think drawing is such an essential thing, because children, whatever is in their foreground, they're likely to put it down on paper, likely to express themselves. So it's also allowing them permission and giving them an opportunity to articulate what is sitting inside, and then to actually take that, process it with the child. I think those are important things to work with.
Yeah. Dr. Shaheda, I think we're having this conversation as well because I'm keen to know whether a time like this can actually shape a child's perception about a certain leader or even a certain country, depending on what they hear, what they read and what they see. Say, for instance, in the media, if they're far away from, let's say, Ukraine and Russia, and they're right here in South Africa. Do you think what they read and see will, of course, shape how they grew up perceiving a particular leader or a country based on the events of today?
Indeed, I think all these children's, surrounded by violence, the conflict, and the rulership, I think those are things that would influence a child unless they have been supported, they've been receiving professional intervention. It could certainly affect their neural pathways in terms of the future and predispose them to other behaviors or self-destructive patterns because they feel powerless, hopeless, and helpless in the situation. It would definitely have long-term implications.
All right, we'll leave it there. And I appreciate your time this morning, Dr. Shaheda Omar from the Teddy Bear Foundation for Abused Children, Clinical Director there, talking to us about how you can have a conversation with children at this particular time. Could be confusing. We're just, of course, dealing with COVID-19. Now there seems to be a war breaking out between, Russia and Ukraine, or at least that those attacks and military invasions intensifying. They could be traumatic for children. Make sure you do have those conversations with your children.